Okay, again, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Aaron Mutall from the FreeMind Group. I'm with our business development team, and I'm going to be joined momentarily by Mr. Ron Littman. He's a senior grant consultant with a lot of experience in helping our clients prepare detailed budgets that are both accurately constructed and also well justified. But before I introduce Ron, I actually wanted to just take a quick moment and briefly speak about the FreeMind Group. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we've been around since 1999. Now we have right around 35 full-time employees who are handling over 400 clients. That's spread between academia as well as industry, and we really do work with the entire spectrum of the life sciences within the startup community as well as the large pharma community, everything in between. And our team is handling right around 250 applications, submissions per year, and to date we've helped our clients raise just under $2 billion in awards. Our overarching goal at the FreeMind Group is to help our clients raise as much money as possible from non-dilutive sources, mainly from the NIH and DoD, but other sources as well. And we have a series of goals in order to help our clients get there. Among them, identifying the most relevant funding opportunities for our clients' research, where their projects are right now, and where they intend to be in the next couple of quarters, couple of years. And we do that by building a strategy, a comprehensive strategy with our clients in order to maximize the potential application's chances for award. And then eventually we'll proceed to actually writing grants, and we manage the very complex project production process involved in executing scientifically coherent, professionally sound applications. Please note, though, obviously, as we do this with our clients, we do write grants with our clients, so it is a joint application writing process, meaning to say that we don't write the grants outright for our clients. And then finally, where applicable, when the grants do come through or the contracts come through, we help in. We also offer the service of helping in the final contract negotiation component as well. Also, just real briefly about the main source of the opportunities, the NIH. If you just real quickly look at the NIH budget in 2012, which was just under $31 billion, you can see that more than 50% went to research project grants, as well as research centers, another 10%, and then R&D contracts, another 10% as well, meaning to say that a very, very large amount of money, in excess of $20 billion per year, easily is invested in organizations for which is most likely relevant to you, and therefore viewing the NIH as a strategic source of potential income for your organization is something that should be fairly straightforward at this point. Now, I've given a couple basic pointers about how the industry works, as well as our team. And speaking of our team, I would like to introduce Mr. Ron Littman to go over today's webinar, budget concepts, budgets in general.
Thank you, Aaron. Like Aaron said, I'm Ron Littman. I'm one of the senior consultants here at FreeMind, and I'd like to talk to you today about the budget. The budget is one of the most important components of the application, since this section describes how much money you will need and for what purposes. So we want to make sure that we do it correctly according to the expectations of the funding agency and without raising any red flags. So how do you write a budget? Each research project is unique, and so no two budgets are the same. Each project has its own needs that are dictated by the research being proposed. Some budgets may consist of primarily salaries and lab personnel and standard lab materials, while others may require specialized equipment, expert consultants, subcontractors, or extensive collaboration with other groups. The mechanism and solicitation may also impose additional limitations on the size and format of the budget and how it may be distributed. In addition, the reviewers reading the application have certain expectations that are not necessarily defined by hard and fast rules. In order to maximize the attractiveness of the budget, it is best to meet these expectations. In this webinar, I will discuss some of the major challenges and guidelines in writing a winning budget. I will discuss the appropriate size of the budget, the required format, various components including direct and indirect costs, outsourced expenses, equipment, etc. I will also go over the guidelines that determine which costs are allowed. In order to define the scope of the budget and its outline, we must first consider the mechanism and the solicitation. One of the common mechanisms for the early stages of research is an R21. This mechanism is limited to $275,000 over the entire 2-year period of the grant. Notice, however, that this limitation applies only to direct costs. The indirect costs do not count toward this limitation, and I will be elaborating on direct and indirect costs later on in the webinar. Two other mechanisms are the SBIR and STTR mechanisms. They also limit the budget. The guidelines specify that Phase 1 applications should be under $150,000, while Phase 2 applications are encouraged to be restricted to under $1 million for the entire budget period. Note that these figures are rough guidelines that describe general expectations. In fact, if your project requires it, you may exceed these costs by as much as 50%. The upper limit for SBIR and STTR applications, therefore, is actually $225,000 for Phase 1 and $1.5 million for Phase 2. These upper bounds include all costs in the budget, direct and indirect costs, as well as any fee that is taken by the company. These limits for each of the phases apply both in cases where Phase 1 and Phase 2 are submitted separately, and in fast-track applications where the two phases are submitted in a single proposal. For R01 applications, direct costs cannot exceed $500,000 in any given year unless stated otherwise in the solicitation. Budgets having higher direct costs require advance approval by the institute to which the application is submitted. Requests for such budgets must be submitted well in advance, and approvals are extremely rare. Therefore, we generally present this limitation as a hard cap. In any case, it is always important to read the solicitation carefully, as certain announcements may allow more funds than under the unsolicited mechanism. When reading the solicitation, you should first identify whether the dollar figures cited refer to annual budgets or whether they cover the entire grant period. It is also important to note whether the upper bounds refer to strict limitations or whether they are merely recommendations. Finally, make sure to identify what cost limitations apply to, whether only to the direct costs or whether indirect costs are also included in the limitation. In some cases, your project may cost more than the limitations that the NIH imposes. In such a case, you may need to find other sources to cover the rest. In these cases, you will need to specify what costs you are covering and from what sources, so as to show that you are aware of and have accounted for all of the costs of the project. NIH budgets come in two formats, modular or detailed. The modular budget is simpler and more convenient, but it can only be used in certain cases. Specifically, it is intended for smaller and simpler budgets. Therefore, a modular budget should, and in fact must be used, when none of the budget periods exceed $250,000 in direct costs. Also, modular budgets may only be used if the applicant is an American organization and when it is submitted under a mechanism that supports modular budgets, for example, your standard R01s and R21s, and your smaller R15s, R03s, or R43. Other mechanisms, such as SBIRs and STTRs, or cooperative agreements with the NIH, mechanisms such as U01s and U19s, require detailed budgets. Detailed budgets must also be used if the applicant is a foreign institution, if any of the budget years exceeds $250,000, or if the solicitation specifically requires it. As I've said before, the modular budget is easier on both the applicant and the reviewers. Here, the total cost will be presented in multiples of $25,000 for up to $250,000 per year. For these sums, the NIH takes a ballpark figure approach and just tries to see if the bottom line that you're asking for each year makes sense, considering the scope of your work, the personnel that you're employing, and the subcontracted costs. Therefore, no full budget justification is needed. All you need to provide is a summary of the personnel involved and their time contribution, as well as the subcontract and consortium partners that you're employing and what they will be responsible for. In addition, if annual costs differ between budget years, then the NIH requests an additional narrative justification explaining these differences. Here you can see an example of what a modular budget looks like. As you can see, all you need are your own total direct and indirect costs, which, like I said, I will elaborate on these later on. And if your consortium partners include their own indirect costs, then you can include those too. This format should be completed for each of the budget years. The second budget format is a detailed budget. As its name implies, it is much more detailed than the modular budget, and completing it requires more work. This budget includes a breakdown of all the costs by category and subcategory. A detailed budget justification needs to be provided that names each of the costs, explains what they are needed for, and how you arrived at the dollar amount you're requesting for each item. Here you can see an example of a detailed budget. The next 3 slides need to be completed for each budget year. In detailed budgets, you need to name each person on the project and how much time they're contributing. This will also be required in the personnel justifications for the modular budgets, but here you actually write how much money you're giving each of them as a function of their annual salary and taking fringe benefits into account. Here you should be aware of the budget cap for senior personnel, which is updated each year. It currently stands at just under $180,000 per year. Note that the personnel category of your budget should include only personnel from the organization whose budget is described. Personnel from other institutions, be they consultants or collaborators from another laboratory, should appear under the consultant's cost item or within the collaborator's sub-award budget, as I will describe a bit later. This is the second page of the budget, which includes some of the additional costs. As you can see, the detailed budget form has places for many different kinds of costs. Only some of this will be relevant for any given grant. Notice that in this example, there are no costs reflected for the equipment. I will expand on this later. On the third budget page, you can see still more cost categories, as well as the details of the indirect costs for the applicant and your consortium partners, as we've seen in the modular budget. This is also where you upload the budget justification, where all the costs you are requesting are broken down and explained. I'd like to expand on a couple of the cost categories, starting with a few words on equipment. Equipment is generally defined as an item of property that costs $5,000 or more and has an expected service life of more than 1 year. This is in contrast to materials and supplies, which tend to be disposable. The NIH sees its role as funding specific research, not the laboratories themselves. They usually do not look kindly upon funding equipment, as they expect you to already have all the equipment that you need. If you ask for standard laboratory equipment, such as a small item like a desktop centrifuge or personal computer, or even as large as an HPLC or an electron microscope and such equipment, then they will suspect that this equipment will serve for many other uses in addition to the project you're proposing. They will see this as an attempt to set up your laboratory with new equipment using NIH funds, and this is not their policy. The NIH may make exceptions if the piece of equipment is very specific for the project being proposed. For example, if you need to have an item custom-made for the specifications of the project, or if this item has no other uses other than what is proposed in the application. If you do ask for equipment, it should be very well justified why this project needs a particular piece of equipment and how it will be used exclusively for the proposed work. Many laboratories are not entirely self-sufficient for a particular project and cannot perform all of the proposed work on their own. Alternatively, they may find it more efficient or beneficial to contract some of the work required or to partner with existing or new collaborators who have more suitable facilities and are more familiar with certain aspects of the research or with techniques or models being proposed. In such cases, some of the budget will be outsourced. There are 3 kinds of outside contributors that are recognized. In some cases, some of your research may cover areas that are new to you, or you would like to consult someone who is an expert in the field in order to help you with the study design, advise on the use of certain models or techniques, or assist you in interpreting the results. In this case, you will hire a consultant. This is someone from outside your institution who contributes to the project intellectually, but does not actually do any of the wet lab work themselves, and they don't contribute physical resources. This person will generally be paid as a function of their salary and their percent contribution, or at a fixed hourly or daily rate. Another kind of contributor is a subcontractor. This is usually a commercial company that offers specific services for a fee. For example, you may turn to a company to sequence proteins or nucleic acids, raise antibodies, conduct toxicity studies on animals, or analyze biological samples taken from human subjects. Such subcontractors usually do not contribute intellectually to the study design. You give them for example, samples to be analyzed, a compound to be tested or manipulated, or specifications for a product that you need them to produce, and in return they give you B, the data that they acquired from your samples, the product that they produced according to your specifications, or their manipulation of the product that you sent them. Their costs will generally be quoted according to a rate that they define or that you negotiate with them, and this will include their commercial considerations, although these will not be specified in the budget. The most substantial contribution is usually a consortium partner. This constitutes a collaboration or partnership between the applicant and another laboratory, and usually contributes to the research interests of both labs. The consortium partner will provide personnel to carry out a portion of the work at their own facilities or at facilities to which they have access. They may be in charge of specific tasks, or they may even share in the responsibility for the entire project, as in the case where there are multiple PIs, one from the applicant organization and the other from the consortium partner. Whenever there's a consortium or partnership with an additional laboratory, the consortium partner should provide their own budget, which you will include as a sub-award budget. Subaward budget looks just like the applicant's budget, as you've seen before, but unlike a subcontractor's cost, which has fixed or negotiated quotes for specific services, this item is composed of the sum of the cost of the research for which the consortium partner will be responsible. It consists of salaries for the personnel involved according with their time contribution, the cost of materials that will be needed, and all other costs that go into performing the research. Their indirect costs will also be listed according to their own negotiated rate. FreeMind's consultants are always there to help you define under what category your outsourced costs fall and what you will need from your partners in terms of sub-award budgets, resources, bio-sketches, and letters of support. The final item on the budget is the indirect cost. This item appears on both modular and detailed budgets, and the distinction between these costs will help you understand what costs are allowable and which aren't. Let's start with the direct costs. Direct costs are those costs that are directly associated with the tasks that you are proposing in your application. It includes the personnel who will be working to perform or oversee the tasks described, the materials, supplies, and animals that will be used for the experiments, subcontractors hired to perform certain tasks, equipment that will be needed, travel to sites to coordinate the work and inspect the progress, etc. In contrast, there are other costs that are also required in order to maintain the research environment, although these are not associated with any particular research project. These may include administrative costs, such as CEOs, CFOs, secretarial and accounting services, renting the facilities, maintaining the equipment, utility bills, etc. These costs may be defined as F&A or G&A, depending on what they include. There are also additional indirect cost rate categories. These costs will be incurred by the company regardless of what research is being conducted. The indirect costs are a function of the sum of all research being conducted. After all, more research may mean more maintenance of the equipment, more personnel and human resource management, expansion of the laboratory may be required, you might need more electricity, etc. Therefore, the NIH pays for indirect costs as a percentage of the direct costs to cover for its share in the load of the research environment. However, please note that these costs are not broken down or detailed. You do not list what the indirect costs include. FreeMind's consultants advise on what costs you may request under direct costs and which are not acceptable and are expected to be covered by the indirect costs. So how do we budget for indirect costs? Like I said, this is calculated as a percent of the direct costs. The percent will either already have been negotiated with the DHHS or other government agency, or you will write a provisional rate which will serve as a basis for negotiation prior to the award. When negotiating, it will take into account your organization's administrative needs and research support that is offered. For companies, this figure tends to be between 20 and 40%, while larger institutions, such as universities and hospitals, which have much more substantial administration and support a wide variety of departments and services, will generally have a much higher indirect cost rate. On the other hand, foreign applicants are limited to an indirect cost rate of 8%. Now, I said before that the indirect costs are taken as a percentage of total direct costs. This is generally true, but there's a stipulation involved. The indirect costs are actually the product of an indirect cost rate and a value called the indirect cost base. The indirect cost base is based on the total direct cost. However, certain exclusions need to be made. Equipment cannot be included in the indirect cost base. Also, outsourced costs need to be excluded as they are not subject to your administration. You may only include the first $25,000 of your outsourced cost in the indirect cost base. In some cases, the negotiated agreement between The government and your institution may impose additional limitations on what you may or may not include in the indirect cost base. Note also that in many cases where the solicitation or mechanism limits your budget, this restriction may only apply to the direct costs. As such, you may want to separate your collaborators' costs into direct and indirect costs if they are willing to do so that you can fit more money into the budget. Okay, so we've discussed the budget framework and the structure. But what about the content? I'd like to give you some tips on how to approach the writing process. Firstly, make sure to build the budget from the bottom up. You should define each cost that you will need and see how they add up. Don't define ahead of time what the bottom line will be and then decide roughly how to distribute it and what you can ask for to justify that sum. Be complete but concise. All costs should be explained. It should be made clear what each item is needed for, in what budget year you will need that money, and how you arrived at the price that you're requesting. You should be thorough enough to convince the reviewers that you have a good sense of the cost of each of the items and that everything is accounted for. Make sure that you're realistic and that the costs that you cite reflect true market values. You should consider the full spectrum of costs that your research will require. You should investigate ahead of time what the various item costs, for example, reagent costs or travel expenses, and get a good assessment of what you will need. Ask for just what you will need, no more and no less. If you try to request more than you need, then you may appear greedy, as if you're trying to abuse the NIH budgets for other purposes. On the other hand, you should also not under-budget your application. Some researchers believe that if they ask for less money, then it would make their application more attractive, but this is not the case. Applications are granted according to their scientific merit. If you ask for less money, then the reviewers might get the impression that you are not aware of the costs or of what you need to complete the research, and that you can complete the research with the fund you requested. However, if you find that you are exceeding the limits that we discussed above, then make sure that you write the costs anyway, but state how you will cover them. Do not simply omit them, because then it will appear as though there is something missing that you aren't taking into account. In completing the detailed budget, make sure to read the solicitation carefully. Solicitations sometimes introduce additional costs that they require you to include. For example, especially in cooperative agreements, they may request for you to budget an annual trip for the PI to travel to the NIH, present your findings, and coordinate with the other PIs on the program. Ultimately, you will be judged on 4 criteria. Reasonableness. Make sure that what you are asking for meets your needs without going overboard, and that the costs that you cite reflect the market value for these items. As I've said before, you do not want to be excessive, and you do not want to underestimate your needs such that you cannot meet your goals with the amount requested. Allocability. Make sure that the costs that you are requesting are really going for what you say they are. Don't try to hide costs or unallowable costs in other places. Consistency. Make sure you know which costs should be charged as direct costs and which are expected to be covered by your institution through the indirect costs. This should be consistent throughout the application and, in fact, in all of your applications. Your budget also needs to meet the regulations of the funding agency, for example, with respect to salary caps, inclusion and exclusion of costs from the indirect cost base, and which items may be requested in the first place. As I mentioned above, it is very important to read the solicitation to learn about the budget limitations in terms of direct and indirect costs, and to be aware of additional limitations or requirements. Of course, our consultants will be available to guide you through the process and help you present an attractive, realistic, and justifiable budget. And now back to you, Aaron.
Ron, thank you very much. And I do see that we have a few questions for Ron. But actually, before we go to the questions, Ron, if you don't mind, there's a couple more slides that I also prepared. And I wanted to take a step back, and kind of, think about what really creates a winning award. What's the approach that one needs to take? And in order to really understand what is required to have a winning approach to grant writing at the NIH, we have to understand the NIH review process. So first of all, obviously, and Ron and I had actually spoken about this earlier, the review process at the NIH has 5 different criteria: innovation, leadership, environment, significance, and then, of course, most importantly, is the scientific approach. So certainly it's obviously very true that you have to be responsive to the specific calling. If you're not responsive, it wouldn't make sense to submit. But not only is it important to be responsive, it's also important to be competitive. So how do you really become competitive? It's a very important question that must be addressed, and that's addressed through these 5 criteria. And just by mention, this is a lot of what our work at the FreeMind Group is centered around, to make sure that we help highlight how you are innovative and significant, and you can demonstrate the leadership that's required to really carry the project through. And by demonstrating clearly to the NIH that you meet these 5 criteria, or most of these 5 criteria very, very well, that helps them understand why you would not be a risk for them to invest in you. And as you become less and less of a risk to the NIH, you become more and more of a potential asset. Therefore, you become stronger in their eyes, and thus you're more competitive to actually obtain an award. So to understand how to really start going forward and maximizing your chances in the review process, it's critical that we do set up that you set up a strategic approach. And so, just a couple ingredients towards having a strategic, systematic approach. Number one, know the interest of the agency in hand. Once you know the interest of the agency, and you've had discussions with program officers, or you've had discussions with people who have had discussions with program officers, and you understand the nature of your project, then it's critical to focus your project towards the interests of the agency, to connect dots that may need to be linked. And that's what will really help move an application forward and make it a much stronger application. Obviously, as you're building an application, ask for what is necessary and not anything beyond what's necessary. Of course, I think that was largely covered by Ron today. And then lastly is the 2 last bullet points actually really go together. Presenting a complete project, meaning to say, if in the case, and it happens frequently, that you want to pursue a project and you're building an application, but in order to really complete this project, there's maybe a couple small but critical gaps that need to be filled. And in that situation, it is very, very, very critical that you leverage the opportunities in the market by building appropriate collaborations, whether they're with consortiums, consultants, or other outside organizations. Further, to maximize your chances towards award, you have to understand which mechanism, or actually I would say with an S at the end, mechanisms, are the best for you to pursue. So understand that there are different, quote, pockets of money. That's a term that we like to use at the FreeMind Group because it's very, very true. And to elaborate on that, a lot of our clients, in fact, unfortunately, even still to this day, oftentimes come to us after half a decade or a quarter of a decade, only focusing in one particular mechanism, because that's the mechanism that they've always known for 20 or 30 years throughout their career, and that's the mechanism they focused in. But not understanding the entire breadth of the market as it may potentially relate to that organization could allow them to no longer keep themselves within the ballgame, so to speak, for other funding opportunities, other pockets of money that are available, and maybe those opportunities for which they're not focusing actually do have higher chances of success. You never know. So to really understand the entire landscape, the entire funding landscape, you have to go through a thorough strategic assessment in order, again, to maximize your chances for award. And by the way, that is a core service of the FreeMind Group, which our team performs. And just real quickly about the FreeMind Group, along with Ron, there's another, right around 35 full-time employees divided between analysts and also grant consultants and writers. They're led by Mr. Guy Harchin. He's the manager of the Professional Services Department, and also just to relate, the manager of Ron's team is Joel Knopf. He's the manager of Consulting Services. And together, these professionals go through, two core services that we offer. The first core service, again, is this strategic assessment process, whereby we would go through a long-term strategic approach by first understanding your project, your pipeline, or your projects, what tasks need to be completed in the short run, what tasks need to be completed in the next couple of quarters, a couple of years, and then linking your projects with existing, again, to use the term, pockets of money that may be available, whether they're solicited or unsolicited mechanisms. And then eventually we'll come back to you with our initial strategic assessment, which will map out relevant funding opportunities available in the very short-term future. And we do this in order to eventually help you build a multi-submission granting strategy, because ultimately the real way to maximize your chances for award is when and if you approach the market in its fullness by submitting all applications for which you are truly competitive and again responsive and again competitive. And after we do this initial process, of course, we'll do this on an ongoing basis as you are actually engaging us in our second core service, which is the department from which Ron comes, and that is, again, a grant consulting, grant writing itself. It's a very delicate, complex project production process. We manage and coordinate the entire application process from the moment we've decided to pursue an application all the way through submission and the final negotiations for a grant. We do this with comprehensive templates that Ron and his team have developed over the last 10 plus years, and we'll always, of course, provide you ongoing feedback and edits where and if applicable, if necessary. And one of the central areas where we take very, very seriously, of course, the whole application, but a major component, of course, is ensuring that we have an accurate and well-justified budget. The final outcome is for us to make sure that we have a scientifically coherent and professionally sound application that stands the best possible chance before a review board. Just to kind of see in a diagram form, a schematic form of how our professional process plays out, our clients would come to us first, again, with their R&D funding needs and their interests, and eventually we'll help them develop, again, this multi-submission granting strategy by producing this strategic assessment, understanding what the market is and is not offering them, and then we translate that granting strategy into particular applications to execute, to produce, and ultimately submit. All the while, we'll still be analyzing the market for future opportunities that may be relevant for our clients. And when applicable, once the granting agency has given a final review that's positive towards an award, we will be there with you to engage in the final steps in the negotiation process if applicable. So I think this slide, basically lays out the schematic process of our professional services. If you have any questions, in addition to the ones that we have here, I'll be happy to entertain them offline. You can email me at aaron@freemindconsultants.com. I also have my office line here. I'm certainly more than happy to speak with you. Thank you very much for listening to our budget webinar. One last quick thing before we turn it back over to Ron for the Q&A. If you want to see us online, FreeMindConsultants.com, as well as our YouTube channel, we will have all of this information, this webinar posted, as well as our previous and future webinars. And certainly, of course, check us out on Twitter as well. So, Ron, I think now we have some questions. The first one is, can these slides be found somewhere? Actually, that's for me. And yes, we can get these slides in the PowerPoint to you. Not a problem. The second question, Ron, relates to padding the budget. What does padding the budget really mean? Can you expand on that?
Yes, well, padding the budget means that you're requesting a lot more money than you need. Basically, it's a national tendency for some researchers to say, well, let's see how much I can get, and then try to justify how you can ask for those costs. Now, as I said in the talk, the budget should really be built from the bottom up. You should look at the cost of your research, what reagents you need, what materials, what personnel you need, partners, etc., and then see how much that amounts to, rather than looking at the maximum total that the mechanism allows, and try to fill it in accordingly, because that's they don't look kindly on that.
Okay, great. I hope that clarifies the gentleman's question. Third question relates, can you explain the difference between a subcontractor versus a consultant?
Well, subcontractors are companies that offer certain services like sequencing DNA or running animal studies, your standard pre-IND enabling work. Whereas consultants are really experts in the field. They may be researchers in their own right who have been studying the matter at hand for decades, and they're really the top expert in the field. Or you might have professional consultants too, in which case that will be similar to a subcontractor, and there's some gray area in defining that.
Oh, okay. I think that answers the question. The third question here is to explain the exact nature of how to clarify costs. Specifically, for example, items like travel. How do you itemize that exactly right in the future? So, if I understand the question correctly, if you're how do you know exactly how much travel costs will be in the future, things like this, and how do you make sure that that's exact?
Well, in terms of defining the travel costs, you want to look at what trips need to be made. If they're to collaborators or subcontractors to supervise work being done off-site at another location, you need to look into what your travel costs include. If they're aerial or ground transport, lodging, food, etc. And you can look you can do some market research looking into flights and hotels and so forth. You can look at other budgets that you've proposed or that your colleagues may have proposed, and in any case, what you present is an estimate. So it's not supposed to refer to a particular quote you've done, unless obviously you have something like that already.
Okay, great. I see actually the next two questions relate more to my area. So I want to actually save those. There's still yet another question that's relevant to Ron's side. Ron, indirect costs defined. I guess somebody would like us to go over indirect costs again real quickly.
Well, basically, indirect costs are costs that are not associated with any particular experiment that you're proposing, but these are costs that are necessary in running the business or the administration for services that are provided, utility bills, and so forth. So it's not directly associated with experiments, and is presented as a percentage of the indirect cost, which is derived from the total direct cost of the application. I see also that there's a specific question on calculating the indirect costs, on whether outsourcing money includes money to subcontractors or collaborators. For collaborators, you do mention them in the direct costs, but they're not supposed to be included in the indirect cost base. So they will be a part of the budget. If you have a consortium partner, then they should provide a subaward budget. But their indirect you cannot charge indirect costs over those outsourced costs, and this can sometimes be a substantial part of the budget itself.
Okay, so I want to swing back now to these other two questions that we have here, which are more in my area, my realm of work. The first question is, can you please explain what the term non-dilutive means? And the second question relates to our business model. Let me first take this topic of non-dilutive. So meaning not money that would dilute from your organization's structure, i.e. Anybody that would be willing to give you money in order to take a portion of your enterprise. And this, so non-dilutive meaning rather than investor dollars, grant dollars. These dollars do not dilute from your ownership structure, and that's what makes the granting, what makes going forward with grants so critical, because it can really leverage your position as you start engaging with, for example, VCs. And just along that line, non-dilutive funding has kept pace and even outperformed dilutive funding for the last few years. So that's pretty significant to keep in mind. billions of dollars being invested in the life sciences, in companies in the life sciences, from non-dilutive sources has kept or outpaced the VC community for the last couple of years. That is really, really critical to understand so that you can appreciate how important non-dilutive funding should be to your overall organizational approach. Okay, now in terms of our business model, that's a good question. And basically, we have a success-oriented business model that helps our clients move forward with the multi-submission granting strategy, which we talked about earlier. And we do, although the majority of our earnings come from award fees through a success-oriented model, we do also have a monthly retainer model as well that helps us keep pace with our clients so that we can help our clients towards this multi-submission granting strategy. I will definitely be happy to go into the nitty details about that, how the monthly retainer model and the award fee models come together offline. You can email me, or we can talk on the phone and set up a conference call. Either way. And I think that actually concludes the questions that we have. So again, thank you very much to everybody who attended, and also thank you, Mr. Littman, for your insights on how to construct a well-justified and accurate budget. We will have this posted on our YouTube channel soon, and we will definitely be happy to get you the slides as well. So again, thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.